The side chick who buried her ogre's wife alive. A story by Eby's Heart. Madame Abiola have been married to Ola for 8 years. They have 2 children together. Being an average family, Madame Abiola had a supermarket where she sells all kinds of things. She had 4 sale girls, because her shop was always filled up with customers. Her husband Ola was an importer of quality fabrics. Hence life was good. They were this kind of family everyone admired in church, meetings, and social media. They always had elaborate birthdays and anniversaries, where they profess love and commitment to each other. Ola have never cheated on Madame Abiola, or so she thought. She would always say how her husband has never cheated and would never cheat on her. Then one day she employed Sandra. Sandra was a secondary dropout, who always told people how the death of her father made her a school dropout. Madame Abiola took pity on her after hearing her story, and employed her, even though she didn't need a new staff then. Sandra turned out to be a good staff in the eyes of Madame Abiola. She would report the other sales girls, and gradually Madame Abiola started laying her older staff off, for being cheats. This was according to Sandra's iService report. Before long, Sandra became the head staff, and Madame Abiola trusted her completely. She would even run personal errands for Madame Abiola, and even help her out with her home chores. When Madame Abiola and her family moved into the new duplex they built, Sandra was on ground to help them. She partly became part of Madame Abiola's family. This girl has been a blessing to me. Madame Abiola would sing Sandra's praises in front of her friends. Ola and Sandra started dating 6 months after she started working for Madame Abiola. Whenever Ola was traveling, Sandra, who had her madam's trust, would equally take permission to take care of her ailing mother, in order to travel with Ola. Gradually Ola and Sandra became so close, to the extent that Ola would leave his family and spend days in Sandra's flat. With time, Ola bought a car for Sandra, rented a flat in a very rich neighborhood. And to crown it all, he opened his wife's kind of business for Sandra. But Sandra put someone in charge of the store and kept working for Madame Abiola. Then one day, Ola and Sandra were caught in a restaurant in another state having lunch, by one of Madame Abiola's former sales girl. She simply videoed them and sent it to Madame Abiola. Madame Abiola's world came crashing. She could not believe what was on the video. So, she confronted her husband instantly out of anger. "You are cheating on me with Sandra?" was the message she sent to Ola immediately she saw the video. Ola, who was in the arms of Sandra, showed her the text message and told her to stop working for his wife and go into hiding for now. Sandra was upset and bitter by this development. But she had no choice than to keep low. Madame Abiola called Sandra severally, but she refused to pick up. She sent her a lengthy text, abusing her and cursing her as well. Sandra simply resumed in her own shop, but ran down the business with expenses. "Hello Ola, we need to see, why have you not been picking my calls? I need some money." Sandra was talking to Ola on the phone angrily. "Relax Sandra, I told you to keep low for now, let me organize my marriage." Ola said apologetically. "Marriage? I thought you said she was a mistake. Please, we need to see," Sandra shouted on the phone. Ola cut the call, and this angered Sandra so much. "So, he wants to use and dump me? After all this while, he has now remembered that he was married?" The pain of rejection and the fear of going back to poverty, after tasting luxury, made Sandra to start trailing Madame Abiola. She kept threatening Ola, who was not even responding to her text messages again. One day, Ola visited her to break things up with her. "Sandra, I know I promised you forever, but I cannot lose my marriage," Ola said, scratching his head. "My wife is threatening to divorce me, and I cannot allow that. So please stay away from me," Ola said and tried to leave. But Sandra started crying and begging him not leave her. "I love you," she pleaded. But Ola simply walked out of the door. Sandra was so pained. So, she decided to tear their marriage apart. She started monitoring Madame Abiola to know when she won't be at home. So anytime Madame Abiola leaves her house, Sandra would go there, enter her kitchen, take food, eat and sleep in their matrimonial bed. She kept doing this for almost a month. She knows her way around Madame Abiola's house, since she was almost living with them before. She also knows where they keep the key to their front door. With time, she started stealing from them. She would take money today, another day, she would take clothes or jewelries. Then one day, Madame Abiola's mechanic came to take her car. So, when Sandra saw Madame Abiola's car leaving their compound, she thought it was Madame Abiola. But Madame Abiola's was home with her son who was sick and didn't go to school. Sandra, as usual, came into their compound through an opening in their fence. She went straight to the kitchen as usual, collected food from the pot and was eating. Madame Abiola, who was sleeping in her son's room, heard the sound of plate and spoons in her kitchen. She quietly came out in order not to wake her son up, and walked quickly but quietly to the kitchen. The shock on her face when she came face to face with Sandra was huge. Sandra immediately ran and picked a knife, and said, "If you move, I will cut myself and you would be blamed for it." Madame Abiola, who was still confused and blank at ideas on what to do, quickly ran towards her to beat the hell out of her. But Sandra picked the pot of food she had warmed earlier and poured on Madame Abiola's face. She staggered and grabbed Sandra's hair. And fight started. They fought for some minutes, and Sandra was able to pick a kitchen chair and hit Madame Abiola on the head. She staggered and fell to the ground. Sandra ran into the house, took a rope she saw in their storeroom and tied Madame Abiola up. Madame Abiola was so weak and almost unconscious. Sandra started telling her all the things she had lost since she broke up with Ola. "My business collapsed. I have not bought a new cloth since you destroyed my sweet relationship with Ola," Sandra said and laughed like a mad person. Madame Abiola was enraged, but was totally helpless. "So today, you are going to pay dearly," Sandra said and stuffed a rag into Madame Abiola's mouth, so that she wouldn't shout. She dragged Madame Abiola, who was struggling to free herself, to the back of the house. Madame Abiola had a little garden behind her house, where she had been reserving for flowers. Sandra used a bucket to cover Madame Abiola's head, and started digging the ground. She dug it to a reasonable extent and said, "Madam of the house," then laughed again. "I am not going to kill you, but your garden will." She dragged Madame Abiola into the place she dug, pushed her in, and started covering her up, with the bucket on her head. When she was done, she arranged the garden the way it was and went into the house. It was when she was cleaning the kitchen that she heard Auntie Sandra, and a sound of tiny feet running towards her. "Auntie Sandra, welcome," Junior said while hugging Sandra. She became confused and asked, "You did not go to school?" "Yes, Auntie Sandra, my body was hot and my mommy gave me medicine," Junior said, giggling happily. Junior, appearing, put Sandra off, but she quickly thought Junior could be useful as well. Sandra took Junior to the parlor, and told him to wait for her there. She then ran upstairs to Madame Abiola's room and packed everything of value into a bag. She was about to step out when she heard a horn at the gate. She quickly ran to the parlor, picked Junior and the bag, ran to the back of the house. Junior kept saying, "My daddy is back," but Sandra hushed him and said, "No, it is not your daddy, it is bad men. So, come, let us hide quickly, so that they will not catch us," Sandra said, smiling nervously. "And do not make any sound, okay?" Sandra instructed Junior. They crawled into an empty big drum that was used during the building of the house, and waited. Madame Abiola's mechanic, who had been horning at the gate, came and was shouting, "Madam, madam, I have brought the car back." After shouting and no reply, the mechanic called her line, but heard it ringing in the house. Where did she go? He wondered. He then called Ola and told him that his house was open but there was no one home, that he had dropped his wife's car, and also told him where he kept the car key. When the mechanic left, Sandra came out and boarded a taxi. She traveled to her village with Junior, who seemed happy, because he was traveling with Auntie Sandra. Ola came home to meet an empty house. All his efforts to reach his wife failed. By the time it was late, he started panicking. Where could my wife take our son to? He even called their family doctor, who told him that his wife only called early in the morning to get prescription for their son. The next day, Ola, who was very disturbed, was about to rush to the police station to report the disappearance of his wife and son. This was after calling most of their relatives to know if his wife called them. He was about to drive out with his daughter, when his phone rang. He saw the caller and it was Sandra. He quickly cut the call and shouted, "Not now, Sandra." But Sandra kept calling, so Ola had no choice but to park his car by the roadside and know why she was disturbing him. "Sandra, what?" Ola shouted immediately he picked the call. Sandra laughed so hard and said, "Don't shout at me ever again. Else Junior will pay for it." Ola's heart sank and he started sweating, even though his car air conditioner was on. "What did you say?" he asked, pretending not to have heard Sandra. "You heard me. I need 10 million in cash, prepare it and I will tell you where you will drop it in 3 days' time. If you tell anyone or the police, then Junior will pay dearly, ask your wife." Sandra said and laughed again. Then hung up. Ola quickly ran out of his car to urinate, because he was so tensed. "What did I just hear?" he muttered. He tried calling Sandra back, but her line had been switched off. He called Madame Abiola's sister, who was also a police officer, whom he had been trying to avoid calling, because he knows he would be blamed for everything. "Hello Mommy Femi, I am finished. My wife and son is missing," Ola said with a shaky and teary voice. Mommy Femi simply said, "Calm down and repeat what you just said." Ola repeated himself crying. "I am coming to your house now," Mommy Femi said and cut the call. In the next 1 hour, Ola's house was filled with police officers, who were asking questions upon questions. Ola told them all about Sandra and the call he had received earlier from her. They blamed and called him names. They tried all they could to reach Sandra. The police went to Sandra's mother, but she and her sibling have not heard from her for 2 days. They were also worried about her. "Sandra is a good girl, she has never left home without telling us where she was going to," Sandra's mother said, crying. 2 days later, Madame Abiola's grave was discovered by the police, who were disturbed by the strong smell coming out of Ola's garden. This shattered Ola and he broke down and wept like a baby. Everyone blamed him for this misfortune. Madame Abiola's sister arrested Ola as an accomplice. The pain of losing her only sister due to her husband's carelessness made her so angry. On the agreed day, Ola was given a phone to inform Sandra that her money was ready. She took Junior there, told him to sit and wait for her. She carried a bag she thought was filled with money and was about to run, when she heard, "Stop, it's the police." She was arrested, but she felt no remorse. After she was arraigned and prosecuted with a life in prison sentence, she simply smiled and said, "Since I am not good enough for Ola, Madame Abiola cannot have him as well."